Our next panel is entitled We All Grieve, about different cultural expressions of death and mourning. And leading the next panel is our moderator, Steph McDougall, the founder of McDo Preservation, a data-driven, community-driven, historic preservation consulting practice in Houston, Texas. Welcome, Steph.
Thanks, Laura. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for We All Grieve, Session 8 of All Together Here, a community symposium for discovery and remembrance. Thank you to our hosts, the City of Austin's Cultural Affairs Division and the Department of Parks and Recreation, and to our panelists. I am your moderator today, and as Laura said, I'm a historic preservation consultant in the Houston area. I was part of the team that developed the City of Austin's Historic Cemeteries Master Plan, published in 2015. That was the beginning of my interest in the preservation of historic cemeteries. Today, in order to be a more effective advocate and ally, I'm pursuing a PhD in public history focused on historically segregated cemeteries and how city governments that own them can work toward equitable treatment for non-white, non-Anglo burial grounds, as well as reconciliation with descendants whose communities have been subjected to discrimination and disenfranchisement by white people in positions of power. We know that in Texas and throughout the United States, the lives and final resting places of African Americans, Indigenous, ethnic Mexican, Asian, and other people of color historically have not been valued or treated with the same respect as those of white Anglo people. In addition, the rise of professional cemetery maintenance and management between 1900 and 1920 led in some cases to the widespread removal of grave markers, mounded dirt over graves, grave goods and offerings, and other evidence of cultural and religious beliefs. In some cases, entire cemeteries were scraped and leveled with bulldozers and turned into parks or playgrounds. African American cemeteries in Texas were being treated this way well into the second half of the 20th century. As a result, we have much work to do in order to repair these wrongs. And this work requires those of us who work in and with city governments, especially those of us who are white and Anglo, to have and show more respect for our brothers and sisters of color and the graves of their loved ones and ancestors. It requires us to acknowledge that other people and their beliefs and cultural practices are just as valid and valuable as us and ours. The City of Austin's Historic Cemeteries Master Plan took an important step in that direction by acknowledging the diversity of burial practices across different cultures and communities of faith in this city. Just as important, we all need to acknowledge that there is not one right way to grieve. Anyone who has lost a loved one knows that our personal journeys in grief are unique. They're shaped by our families, in some cases by religious beliefs, and by the traditions of communities in which we were raised. The rituals of memorializing our loved ones have changed and evolved over time, but they're part of our essential selves. They connect us across the years to our ancestors, whether we can identify those people by name or not. The people whose graves were covered by the construction of the Oakwood Cemetery Chapel in 1914 are thought to have died in the mid to late 1800s. Because of racism and discrimination at that time, we may never know their names, but we can celebrate their lives, mourn their deaths, and memorialize them appropriately, following the lead of the African American community in Austin and the communities of descendants who are from here but may no longer live here. In this session, we'll talk specifically about African American burial practices and expressions of grief. Each of our panelists today brings a career's worth of perspective and experience to this topic. They include Dr. Carla F.C. Holloway, the James B. Duke Distinguished Professor Emerita of English at Duke University, where she also holds appointments in the School of Law, Department of African and African American Studies, and Program in Women's Studies. Dr. Holloway's research and writing has focused on African American cultural studies, gender, law, and bioethics, Especially pertinent to our discussion today is her 2013 book, Passed On: African American Mourning Stories, a Memorial. Dr. Holloway, thank you so much for joining us today. Our next panelist is Dr. Nidra Lee. Dr. Lee received her PhD at the University of Texas at Austin and is currently an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Her work examines the intersection of race and class in the lives of African Americans during the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Central Texas and the rest of the American South. She's expanding that into New England now. Dr. Lee, we're so pleased to have you with us today. Next up is Pamela Benson Owens, currently the interim executive director of Six Square, Austin's Black Cultural District, and an entrepreneur whose firm, Edge of Your Seat Consulting, partners with for-profit, nonprofit, and faith-based organizations to help them face and address complex and challenging issues. She also serves on the faculty of the Center for Nonprofit Excellence at Austin Community College. Pamela Benson Owens, thank you for being here today. And finally, Dr. Tim Griffith is a senior archaeologist with Moderator Environmental Consulting in Austin, Texas. Dr. Griffith will be involved in the reinterment of people whose remains have been removed from beneath the Oakwood Chapel. And thank you for participating, Dr. Griffith. So the format of our session is as follows. I'm going to ask each panelist a question, and then another panelist will have the opportunity to chime in. At the end, we'll have some time for questions and answers. So if you have a question, please post it in the chat. And here we go. Let's begin with you, Dr. Holloway. You've written about the ways in which African Americans traditionally have expressed grief and honored their loved ones who have died. The people over whose graves the Oakwood Cemetery Chapel was built, we now know died in the mid to late 1800s. How would their families have celebrated and, as you say, funeralized them in the 19th century?
One of the things that we discover about American burial practices and African American burial practices is that they merge. And the mid to late 1800s would have been exactly one of those periods when we found an amalgamation of practices, some which seemed to reflect more US centered practices, and of course those that extended from our memories of Africa. And so those memories of Africa have been most interesting in my research in cemeteries, the way in which grave markers would not only have the name of the person who died, but earlier in the century, in the 19th century, might even have shells, or specifically cowrie shells, or beach things. And I'm talking about East Coast more particularly. That would remind one of the journey from Africa to the US. As that period shifted and moved more closely to the 1900s, you would find broken pieces of pottery, mattress springs, household items, always not in good condition, but if there was a vase like this one, it might be broken onto the grave, symbolizing the break between life and death. The interest was in not having the spirit that has gone continue to have some vitality in today's world. In other words, being afraid of ghosts and haunts. So marking the graves is the most important, I think, memorial. The grief that was expressed and the funeral practices would have been continued today. The repast, the food after the funeral that the community would bring to the family, very different from Africa, in which the family was expected to provide for the community. But in the US, it shifted, that practice shifted. Taking care that there was time for family from distant parts to get to the funeral. And so the practice of embalming and mortuarial sciences were particularly important for African American families that were scattered. And so the conduct at the funeral where grief was expressed, and sometimes in extravagant ways, were ways to make sure that that outpouring was left there at the grave and that life would continue on. And that resilience that you would find in African American communities is expressed in the practices of the funeral, where the grief was extraordinary, but the recovery and the resilience was also extraordinary.
Thank you. Dr. Lee, do you want to add something to that?
Sure. So, I mean, just to piggyback off of what Dr. Holloway said, she discussed the importance of the placement of the marking of the grave. And she already discussed not necessarily the marking of graves through what we typically think of through tombstones or other types of permanent markers, but the significance of pottery or glass. From my research at the Bull Hill Cemetery in Falls County, Texas, one of the things that stood out to me about the process of funeralizing the deceased was also the significance of activities that weren't necessarily tied towards the cemetery, but focused on the social and the community. And so the things that really stand out, as Dr. Holloway discussed, was the wake and the sort of the acts of preparing the body before it's interred, and sitting together and remarking and sort of comforting family and friends. The repast is one of them, but also thinking about what happened even after loved ones or deceased were interred. Family reunions or grave cleanings were two big things that come up quite often in oral histories as acts of not just grieving, but remembrance. Grave cleanings or cemetery cleanings were oftentimes done in conjunction with religious events or historical events that were of significance for Black community members. And they were oftentimes done through the church. So in part of not just sort of Juneteenth, but as people would come and celebrate their family's history, they return to cemeteries to clean them. And also to put new items to mark and identify the placement of graves as an active one. And this is not something that we just see done in the late 19th or early 20th century, but this continues to be an act of remembrance and also an act of grief, even now, and one that does require us as preservationists or archaeologists to think about the ways that processes of grief and remembrance happen away from, the site of actual burial.
Thank you. Pamela Benson Owens, let's pick up that thread and talk about modern funeral practices. What would be incorporated potentially in rememorializing these people whose remains were removed and will be reinterred, and celebrating the cultural legacy of the African American community in Austin?
That's a really steep question that I love. And from the perspective for Six Square in terms of preservation, I've had the opportunity to really kind of think about this and dive into this as we've really had to think about history and how, especially in Austin, for the African American community, the dismount into the process of grief was traumatic. The treatment was poor. There is an underlying foundation of disrespect. And if you think about the process in and of itself, in any faith tradition, in any community tradition around grieving, it's to express love and respect. So oftentimes when those things were removed, if you look at India, if you look at Southern Korea, even though the traditions might look different, it's steeped in love and respect, right? And so, and when you think about it now, and you think about the unfortunate history, when you think about the stages of grief from shock and denial to acceptance and hope, you fast forward to now and acceptance and hope, there's opportunities to go back. And one of the most powerful things you can do is know the stories. I find often in Austin when I'm communicating about the history and I say Givens, I use some of these names where there's a history, right? Samuel Houston, there's this disconnect. So one of the most powerful ways is to know the story and tell the story and have sacred reverence for those Black bodies. I think that's important. I think the also interesting juxtaposition in modern day is if you think about new funeral practices that have come online, right? Eco-friendly burials, water cremation, green burials. A lot of people are now not doing the wake at all, doing at-home burials. Like all of these things are coming online on down to in cremation, what's used with the ashes to make shotgun shells, like all these things that you're learning about. I think they have definitely started to trend in white communities. They're not trending in Black communities. And it's my theory that the reason for that is because there hasn't been a proper extension of the more traditional ways and a respect for the more traditional ways and how those bodies ended up with grave markers that were unmarked or even not there. So I think there's an opportunity really in that large question to say, hold on a minute, let's go back and understand the history. Oh my gosh, there's a Black burial site on the south side. I didn't know that. Why is there a house on top of it? Didn't know it was there. So I think we have an opportunity to do a reset and a recalibration of those things so that we can truly ground ourselves in the love and respect of the past and linking that to now and never letting that narrative go quiet.
Thank you. Dr. Griffith, as an archaeologist, how do you bring some of these ideas into the work that you do? And I know that your specialty is really Middle Eastern burials, but as we look at these burials here in Austin, how do you incorporate some of those ideas?
Well, I mean, I personally think that when we come across burials, whether it is in the Middle East or the issues that we've come across in the U.S. with unmarked burials, we have to take everything into consideration. We need to view them as a whole within the context and make sure that we involve as many communities as possible that have ideas, that have thoughts, that may have connections to the individuals that are in the tombs or the burials. And I do think that we need to take into consideration, especially here in Texas and in the U.S. with some of these cemeteries that we're dealing with right now, such as Oakwood, which I am going to be a part of. We need to take into consideration why did these things happen? What do we need to do to make sure that we take care of those issues as far as moving forward with other cemeteries across the country, and that we have many, like I said, we have many communities working together, and we approach all the communities with all of the individuals, geographical populations that we know that may be associated with the remains that we are actually exhuming and reinterring.
Sorry, I lost control of my mouse there for a second. Couldn't get it down to unmute myself. Dr. Griffith, we've had a request also to see if you would speak to Mexican and Mexican-American traditions.
Unfortunately, with that question, I do not have a lot of experience with, Mexican-American burials at this time, but I do think that we should always, whether it's Mexican American, whether it's African American, especially if they are unmarked, if we are having to exhume them, we definitely need to pay close attention to the concepts of the community, the individuals in the community, and work closely with them in order to make sure that the proper respect is being provided for the individuals that are being handled, being exhumed, and being reinterred.
I'm going to follow on with something a little bit related. We know that there is a strong tradition of ancestor worship and the continuing of relationships with the deceased in many different cultures, including Mexican and Mexican American cultures. Dr. Holloway, what is the tradition or the culture of continuing relationships and ancestor worship in the African American community?
It's interesting that you'd ask that question, because I'm in the midst of copying and editing a manuscript of mine that deals with a death and a ghost, African-American family. And the mother tells the daughter, go to sleep, because when you are asleep, that's when the ancestors will come and tell you what to do. Now that's a West African belief, but in many ways, the belief in ghosts and haunts and painting houses a certain color, or front porches a certain color, or having bottle trees that are not connected to a cemetery, but like the bottle tree outside of my house right now that I had, are ways of understanding that the ancestors still have a say in today's world. It is not as formalized and I also wanted to say the connection between Dia de los Muertos with the Spanish cultures, Mexican cultures, it's very much like what Memorial Day is. A lot of people think Memorial Day was begun as a tribute to soldiers, but African Americans actually started Memorial Day after the Civil War with an honor to the Civil War Black dead, beginning, as Dr. Lee so rightly reminded us with cleaning and preparing the graves. And so as we continued Memorial Day, it was a cleaning and preparation of the graves, very much like the Day of the Dead. And whether they are actual iconography in the house, I mean altars, which you will find in some New Orleans communities, or the memories. I'm in a room right now where the only people that can be in here, pictures that can be here, are people in my family who have passed. It's the library of the house, but I have this thing that your picture cannot be in here until you are gone. So families do individual things to make sure that, and this is particularly relevant to what Pam Benson Owens said about visibility of our lost. And so if a church is suddenly on top of a burial ground, how are we going to make sure that that visibility of those we have lost is still present? This is why memorials and monuments is such a hot topic in today's culture. Because of honoring the dead, we often find Black Lives Matter in ways that have erased our Black dead. And so whether a family does it in what it thinks is just a family way, it is always an homage to an African memory. And whether that is, I'm going to take a nap on it and see what my mother has to say about it, because I'll hear her in my ear, or continuing to tell the family stories of what great grandma would have said, and those family names that carry traditions, and you are named after your family. These are ways of making sure that the dead are not really dead. They have just passed into a dimension that it is our responsibility to honor. And so I think there are connections between our cultures, whether they are Mexican and Mexican American, or African and African American, that speak to cultures that have been in any way disparaged or challenged, are particularly interested in having that visibility and acknowledgement. Street corner memorials, T-shirt memorials. We have died and we grieve because we are human.
Thank you. Pamela Benson Owens, I see you over there nodding. Do you want to add anything to this?
I was just going to say I could listen to Dr. Holloway all day, for sure. And the only thing I was going to add that I've just recognized really since this, we've had this, and the only way to describe it is this bubbling up since George Floyd, and this real push-pull about Black and brown bodies is this, that I have recognized now in a lot of meetings, especially with Black leaders, as we're grappling with all of these things about holding on the past, holding on to the past and kind of being in the present, but planning for the future, is the word ancestors now surfaces a lot in our meetings. And I've noticed that a lot lately, where it's like, okay, so like, let's channel the ancestors. I've heard that language, or like the ancestors would not be feeling this right now, or what do you think, how do you feel like they're guiding us? There's a lot more centering around that. And I think it's very powerful as kind of a grounding tool. As far as individuals, we do that very differently in our home, in a way, with a chair. We mark, you have a room, we have a chair that your name doesn't go on it. It's written on it once you've passed. That's our thing. But I've just been really in tune with that lately, that I'm hearing the word ancestors and almost bringing ancestors into the space to help us navigate how to best memorialize and honor. And I think that's different. And that's come as a result of the devaluing of Black bodies being very prevalent, especially now. It's always been there, but especially now.
Thanks. Dr. Lee, we're going to take a little bit of a different angle toward that. You previously studied with Dr. Maria Franklin at the University of Texas, and she's working with Dr. Bolnick at the University of Connecticut on the DNA analysis for some of the people whose remains were removed from Oakwood Cemetery during the chapel restoration project. What might this attempt at identification mean for potential descendants and for East Austin's Black community as a whole?
That's a great question. And I think, there are a word and a phrase that comes to mind when attempting to answer that. And the first one is roots. The interest in the DNA identification is about this idea of reclaiming those who have been lost, and not necessarily lost to people of African descent, but perhaps lost to a broader historical memory. And the DNA identification offers some means for bringing them back into that story, but also a recognition of, or at least a clarification of origins and answering where people may have come from. But there's also a bearing of witness. Because DNA identification may not necessarily give concrete names or clarify concrete blood ties, but there is a particular witness as it relates to the revealing and the sort of confirmation of evidence of violence, but also of resistance as well. And so I think those are two things that really, really stand out in terms of the significance of what DNA information can offer.
Pamela Benson Owens, talk to us about how you think Six Square and the East Austin community is likely to be involved in this memorialization and identification process.
In every step of it. And I would say one of the most powerful tools, voice pieces we have is that several in our community that are legendary pioneers are still on the earth with us in East Austin. And I think sometimes we forget that, right? And so I really see them as the compass to help us fill in the gaps, to tell, there's the story and then there's the real story. And I think we need a hybrid of all of that in the space. And so we are fully engaged and ready from a preservation piece, from a narrative piece, from a guiding the storytelling piece to convene our legendary pioneering history tellers and giving them space and respect to tell the story as they want to tell it, without it being rewritten, without it being edited, without it being shortened, without it being disrespected. And so for us, we are very much committed to making sure that happens and that the integrity for the way they want to share it stands, not to be renegotiated, not to be, omitted, but really shared in a way that brings the pieces together in a powerful way. And then to really make sure that we bridge that by making sure that our generations that are coming behind us understand that what they are sitting in their classes and learning is not the full story. So that when they walk past something in East Austin that now looks like a trendy bar, a coffee shop, a cool restaurant, that they understand where they stand to include our new community members that are living there now. It's important. So when I'm sitting in line at a coffee shop and somebody taps me to educate me about what that new coffee shop is, I take a moment over my pumpkin spice latte to educate them on what it was before that, and before that, and before that. Not in a shame, blame, and guilt way, but in a you better get curious and let me educate you and invite you to think differently about where you're standing kind of way.
Just to add, I mean, can I just say that in many ways, what we are speaking of are narratives of presence and persistence.
Yeah.
And resilience and survival and all of those good things.
And I liked the way that Pam Benson Owens said, in whatever way they want to tell it, because so often we want to shape a narrative. But we have to remember that the stories are often in the gaps. The stories are often in the absent pieces. And those absences are as full of information as the pumpkin spice latte might have for you. Just because you don't visibly see it doesn't mean there isn't a message there. So I would, help school children understand that we can fill in those gaps, either with imagination or with DNA. Both of those methods of remembering, and I mean that in a constitutive way, of putting back together the places, the bones, the bodies, the stories, the folk, with the folk who are still living and have a distant memory of, I remember walking by this place when. And believe me, as an elder in this panel, we do a lot of thinking about those days past, and a way that you might have to recapture those stories is as important as, allowing them to flow and to fit into their own spaces instead of those that we have constructed for them. So I think that word visibility is so important. And if we don't end up having the names for the bodies were buried under a chapel, we have a way to tell there were people here. There was a family here. Here is a relic from that story. The pieces that I found on gravestones in Uchee Valley Cemetery in Florida, which was still a segregated cemetery in 2000, Blacks and Presbyterian church, the white Presbyterian church and its cemetery backed up to a fence where the Black Presbyterian church and its cemetery was. And those stories and those graves were as different as the elegance of one gravestone as opposed to the flat cement marker of another. That tells a story, even though I might not be able to see the name on that gravesite, somebody's leaving stones there. I remember when I visited Louis Armstrong's gravesite in New York and saw that people were leaving coins, and his gravestone has a big trumpet on top of it. So if nothing else matters, this man was a musician. So the kids who pass and say, Louis who? Or Louis, even worse, know that there's a trumpet there. Actually, when I passed that grave, somebody had left out a beer and a submarine sandwich because they knew that he liked this kind of beer. I don't remember what kind it was, but they left his can of beer and a submarine sandwich because people believe we're still feeding these bodies in the present, even though they were gone. It's extraordinary what the stories of what we leave at the gravesite almost tell as interesting and full a narrative as those who were left there.
May I real quick just follow up? It has been brilliant listening to the panel with that discussion just now. And I would just like to add to it, to follow up with, yes, and the narrative, the story of individuals, of communities, and unmarked graves especially, they should have a story, and they need a story. And one of the things that is a big atrocity with this, with a lot of the unmarked graves, especially when it comes to the African Americans, is we end up with unmarked African American graves. They've lost their history twice. They lost their history the first time when they were taken from Africa. Then they lost their history again after they were in America and died and were buried, and then tombstones or headstones just moved away, and now they're unmarked. So I think we all, like you guys were saying, everyone was saying so beautifully, we need to take all of those things into consideration, because in most cultures, from an anthropological perspective, we die two deaths. We die physically, biologically, and then metaphorically the last time someone says our name. And so we strive to try to, typically we humans strive to try to do well in life, do good, so that people remember them. And then that's the whole concept of the headstones and people leaving the beer and the submarine sandwich, trying to hang on to that second metaphorical death of perhaps maybe in the human mind, as we think there is immortality, even though it's not biological. So, but a lot of times the unmarked graves with the African American community, we have to remember those individuals lost their history twice, and we always need to consider that and think about that.
Can I jump in and just say one more thing? One of the lessons that I learned from working on the Bull Hill Cemetery when I was a graduate student was, especially when you are doing archaeological examinations of cemeteries, and cemeteries that have been assumed to have been forgotten or neglected, is to see these as active sites of memory. So they may not be, in terms of how we as the scholars or the preservationists confront them, that they're present, or even maybe the way that they look in the moment in which we are introduced to them. They may not seem live or active, but they are. And whether they are active through the sort of processes of memory that Pam and Dr. Holloway have already talked about, whether it be through sort of the stories that are told, or through the wake, or even through placement of markers. And this question of markers is a really one that comes up quite often, both in terms of affecting how they are actually preserved through formal preservation processes, but also even how community members are oftentimes, and when I say community members, African-American community members are oftentimes forced, or at least put on the spot, about their own investment into these cemeteries. And they're oftentimes sort of forced to say, like, no, we did put markers in, we did ultimately remember our deceased. And this is where we have to sometimes be mindful about the broader processes of systemic racism and also economic exploitation, because the process, this idea of markers, it may actually mean that people did put markers there. Maybe they were actually just removed by others who came in and displaced, and claimed eminent domain on the site. Or perhaps there were markers there, but the markers that were put in place were markers that were of a different type of stone or quality of stone that did not sort of like stand to the test of time and the environment. So it doesn't mean that there weren't markers, or that they weren't there, but what are some of the questions about site formation processes that we have to sort of be mindful of, also in conjunction with making an account of racism and economic exploitation. And so I think these are some of the lessons that we have to also sort of think of as we're beginning to see and make sense of these sites.
I think we also run into this idea that handmade markers somehow indicate an inability to afford a quote unquote real marker, instead of recognizing that making someone's grave marker by hand is really an ultimate sign of respect and devotion. And, you know, we see that a lot with some contention today with members of the white community who have a very specific idea about what a grave marker should look like, and they're not being very kind or respectful about other people's grave markers, and that's not uncommon. But I think that to your point, understanding and being open to the idea that your perceptions or all the baggage that you bring in to those ideas, that's not necessarily the only or the right way. I wanted to just ask Dr. Holloway and Dr. Owens, and you too, Dr. Lee, one last question, because we have just a few more minutes, and that is about homecomings and how present day community members might be able to welcome these people who will be reburied kind of back into the community through homecomings and all other kinds of rituals of grieving and remembrance.
I think the important word you used was rituals, and after that word, I would let it embrace all by itself whatever ceremonies a community might devise, understanding that that is going to be the formal recognition of what we have lost. It's that formality and it's that ability to repeat it. You know, we did it, you know, it's like this tradition that came from, I don't know where, although we have ideas about it, jumping the broom at a wedding. Well, by now it's so much a part of African-American wedding ceremonies for some that people just think of what it means. We need something that specific so that when it is brought forward, people recognize it as a ritual of remembrance and remarking, remaking, renaming the loss. So I don't know what it might be. It's got to be, in my judgment, it has to have some materiality as well as some story, so that there is ceremony as well as the ability to touch and to see and to visualize something. So I would be open to a community saying this is what it is going to be after coming together and consulting with the elders and the youngers and those in between, as long as it is finally the shared acknowledgement as to, yes, this is what we will use to mark our place. And the imaginations of what that might be are as extraordinary as the museum or the memorial in Montgomery for those who have been lynched, or the museum in DC that all by itself is becoming a marker of a certain kind of, I'm talking about the National Museum of African American History and Culture, but the building itself, the architectural rendering of it, is becoming iconic. So I would encourage something that is shared and recognizable and material.
So, wow. Beautiful. Love that. And so I want to answer that by going back to something, Steph, you said something really profound when you were talking about a grave marker and what is considered, you know, acceptable or not. And I think that speaks to, even when I was listening to Dr. Holloway about the description in Florida about how the fence stopped, it was black here, white there. I think this is such a pivotal opportunity for a course correction of everything that we've encompassed as either or. We have a really bad habit of an either or kind of approach. And I think this is such a critical opportunity for both and, right? That it can all exist. And so when you start talking about like, what will those new rituals, what will we reimagine around this process? I think it's really important to really say it, but mean it. When we say we are open to what the possibilities could be, right? And so that sounds to me like that could be visual artistry, that could be verbal, that could be haiku, that could be rap, that could be like, it could be silence, right? We always think we know what that's supposed to be, and there's an opportunity to co-create a new piece for us around what that is, versus saying, no, you can't do that. No, that doesn't work. No, that's not how it's supposed to look. I think there is an opportunity to hold space about what this could be and to respect all forms of what those rituals are, and that there's enough for some of the older traditional ways, new ways, and all forms of that, so that the grief doesn't feel surface. It feels like it's more of something that penetrates the ethos of us as a community, and that there's space for us to have all of that and make that happen. So I think that's a critical course correction opportunity.
I think I will just follow by saying that this homecoming doesn't have to be limited to people of African descent, that this homecoming can also be a sort of awakening and reckoning even for white people, as it relates to the ways that they can ponder the sort of impact of racism, but not just in life, but also in death. And so that's really where I would limit that, whether it's through, as Dr. Holloway's and Dr. Owens said, rethinking, the ways that ethnocentrism or sort of anti-Black sort of stereotypes, sort of how it's reproduced towards the ways that markers are perceived, or the sort of obliviousness that oftentimes is sort of had when we are confronted with sites that are significant to Black history, and just them sort of like falling within a cycle of just getting lost and then found and sometimes re-lost again. But I think that like homecomings are not just a time for us to reflect on the history of those that have been deceased, but to also think about the ways that their lives have had ripple effects on others. So this doesn't just have to be a homecoming for those that have a sort of like blood or genetic or even sort of historical, through the sort of experiences they've had, connection to Oakwood, but that it's an opportunity to broaden that.
I loved what Dr. Owen said about silence, because I think what calls us to silence, and I'm thinking about the tolling of the bell, whether you are a white American, a Latino American, there is a silence that comes when the bell tolls. In Passed On, I wrote about the great historian John Hope Franklin and his son talking about a bell tolling, and John Hope Dr. Franklin said, well, that's what happened in Liberia. Whenever someone died, a bell would toll. And we were talking about the Tulsa race rebellion and riots, and finding that symbology moved from one place to the other, but what it did for everyone was call them to silence. And I love the idea of a sonic moment in here that gathers us all together as a community that both grieves and remembers.
You all have done such a great job today of talking about the opportunities that we have as a greater community to make connections with ancestors, with each other, with people who will follow after us. I'm so grateful to have had the opportunity to make connections with you today. And I'm sure all of our viewers are feeling the same way. We are coming up on our time to answer some questions. So Laura Esparza, I think you may have some for us.
I have a couple. There was a question about silence as remembrance. And I think Dr. Holloway has answered that. How do we mitigate the education, I think, may refer to how do we change the way that how do we change our patterns perhaps, so that we can be more balanced. And what tools do we need to use? And Dr. Holloway, I appreciate your use of the idea of the bell, which I think brings about universally a silence that just resonates to the soul.
Mhm.
Any other thoughts about how we could strike a balance between our different modes of grieving? The reason why I ask that is because we're going to be faced very shortly with putting together a commemoration for people who were Black and Latino and white, women and children, and a wide variety of people, possibly even someone who was Asian. And finding that balance in traditions and yet honoring everyone fully is a dilemma that we face.
I
Any
think
thought?
the idea of shared is so important. Even if it's a newly shared item that pulls us together as cultures and ethnicities in America. I've been thinking out loud because I do it on Twitter at Prof. Holloway, but I've been thinking on Twitter about what will an appropriate memorial be to those we have lost during this coronavirus pandemic, and being very afraid that the ways that this is dividing us will not give us an opportunity to unite us under respect for those that we have lost during this moment. And Laura, it's especially true that these are people from every segment of American life, and a memorial to them must be unifying. And part of that, I think, Dr. Owens, is in the story. So whatever memorial it is, it's our responsibility to tell a story that brings us together. I remember the AIDS, because I'm of that generation, the AIDS quilt that ended up going around the world, I think, and people stitching together. And more important than the various squares on that quilt was the communal stitching and joining memory to memory. So it's the movement, the moment, and the memorial that must come together in a way that we all feel embraced by. It's a challenge, but we've done this before. The important thing is that resilience and knowing that we have that obligation to tell the stories of those who can no longer tell their own stories.
I own that. It is our obligation.
I love that answer. Can I just jump in and say this? Because I hear that, Laura, as you're talking. I just want to say this. We have to be in some vulnerable space to recognize that we might mess up along the way and get some pieces wrong. And just get comfortable with that. And when we recognize that that's happened, pivot quickly and correct it, right? So alongside building community, getting quiet and listening, not assuming what we think we know how it should be done, and all of that, we have to be willing to start and potentially fail fast, recover, and try again.
Begin again.
And I think that part we get right to the edge of it, and then we stall out for fear of offending, and then we don't do anything. And I think we just have to lean into, we are going to do all of these things to listen. We are going to start. And sometimes a community doesn't come forward until there is a sticking point. Even when you feel like you've asked and held space for and asked again and held a forum and done a survey, I need us to get comfortable with all of that, we might still get it wrong. And that's okay. And then what do we do then to recover from that and become restorative in that practice and try again?
Those are the stitches you pull out, you know, and start stitching it again.
And the quilt is not totally messed up.
There you go.
We had a few, like,
Yeah.
the quilt will still keep you warm, even with a couple of missed stitches, right?
And the missed stitches tell a story. We are fallible and we are vulnerable, but we are willing and we are courageous enough to say that out loud, to say that part out loud too. Love it when you say, we might get this wrong, but we are also responsible and obligated to naming the wrong and fixing it again. That's what's going to be the lesson for future generations. They didn't stop, they persisted.
It's not right space, it's brave space.
There you go.
We just need to get in brave space together.
What I oftentimes find very both heartening and also humbling about the work of preserving and also cemeteries and commemorating those who have been interred in them is just the histories that unfold from those practices. And I think that is ultimately, you know, as you were talking, Laura, it's just, there are multiple stories, just as there can ultimately be multiple people embedded in these places. One of the greatest lessons I learned from working, or what I find to be really exciting when I did work at Bull Hill Cemetery, was that this was an African-American cemetery that was largely established on the sort of margins of a plantation and had a history from slavery to emancipation to communities' freedom. But yet on the side of that cemetery were the remains of an Anglo settler, James Coriel. And so literally there's an overlap and an intersection of that history that I think really represents the history of not just humanity, but even within all of these other sort of like imposed ideas of power and identities that connect us. And so that's something that we have to think about, that there are histories that sort of that come out when we actually engage in this practice.
We really are all in this together, you know, and I think that's, it's hard to be all in this together, because you're right. We have to be willing to bump our noses. And I think, you know, for us white people too, you know, we have got to stop being afraid of participating while still being willing to center, you know, other voices and make that important. So I think altogether here is probably a really good title for this symposium, because that's what we're talking about.
That's what we were thinking. There's a question for Dr. Holloway. Do you think that, let me go back to this list. Do you think that the current generation, i.e. The younger folks, are as connected with their ancestors as your generation is?
I think it takes some age to want and to recognize that connection. I do think they are connected to the lost. And that connection to loss is the pathway to our ancestors. Because when we think about children or grandchildren or aunts or uncles who are no longer here, that leads us to think. When we write those funeral programs, the historical documents for me are those programs that say, and she was the daughter of, and her parents were, and she was baptized into whatever church when. When they have to sit down and write that obituary for the funeral program, they get that connection. When they hear it read in church, and that's one of the patterns that we have that you were speaking of earlier, that practice of somebody, the reading of the eulogy. You know, as long as we have the in front of that, the presentation of the offering, the reading of the eulogy, the singing of the psalm, giving it the formality, I think we develop as we grow. that connection to our ancestors. And so that's where that obligation, Laura, that you were speaking of comes in so strongly, because you're not born with a connection to the, oh, actually, I do think you're born with a connection, and it sort of dissolves as we get older. I remember when my grandboy was born, and he would always look at the pictures on the wall and just laugh and talk. And I'm thinking, those folk are talking to you, aren't they? You know what? And he could sense it. And Wordsworth had a connection, you know, wrote about the connection we have when we are younger, that we lose. But I think it's our obligation to restore it. And we do it by memorializing in ways that are familiar, because at the point of the funeral, somebody's got to bring the chicken. Somebody's got to bring, you know, so we know there's funeral food and there's not funeral food. And we're not talking, you know, hors d'oeuvres or whatever, you know, where's the cake? And now we do allow that cake to be store-bought now, but there was a time when you didn't bring a store-bought cake. So as we practice the rituals that were given to us by our parents, that's how our children learn. I have hope and confidence and faith in our younger generation, because they're open to that. We've got to be open to our obligation to, we're always teaching by conduct, by memory, by repeating it, and then by saying we're not going to do it the way we used to, letting them know there was a used to way, you know. But I'm confident that our children learn of our ancestors through our acts.
Thank you, Dr. Holloway. Blessings on you.
Blessings to all.
We're going to transition now because our next session is about memorialization, led by Dr. Jody Skipper. And so we're going to take a little break from the Zoom and be back here at 2:45. Thank you, panel.